Thanks for listening to the Granite.List Live. Today's episode is brought to you by Connect Healthcare Collaboration, where benefits marketing meets clinical advocacy to drive effective employee engagement. This is the Granite.List Live, where we explore all things human capital and employee benefits related. I'm your host, Sally Pace, and today I am joined by Erin Oakes, our dear friend who is the CEO of United Pet Care. As a dog mom myself, I love talking about this wonderful voluntary benefit that really has had it's kind of in its heyday. So Erin, thanks for being on today.
Sally, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. And I want to start, we're very familiar at the Granite.List with the UPC story, but I think it's a fascinating one, including its origins. So Erin, do you mind just starting by telling us a little bit about UPC?
Yeah, absolutely. So United Pet Care has actually been in the market for 30 years. We had our 30th birthday today. So what is that? 210 in dog years.
Happy birthday.
And it was founded by a mom and two daughters. Mom was a force of nature and quite honestly a visionary. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about it, but United Pet Care structure is a little bit different, our product, than traditional pet insurance. We are, I kind of say this tongue in cheek, but we're a little bit like an HMO or a direct primary care model for fur babies. And so Mom, the founder Doris, was actually an executive at a dental discount network, also structured very similar to that plan. And she was also a big animal lover. And so she felt like, why doesn't this exist in the animal space? And so really honestly, through sheer force of will, she and her two daughters started making relationships with vets, largely in the Phoenix and Southern California area. And over about 24 years, they built up this really nice little business in those two markets. Flash forward to 2020, daughters wanted to retire, so they convinced Mom to sell the business. And I kind of, through my own journey, I spent most of my career in what I now lovingly call non-pet healthcare. I was on the human side, but I've always been an animal lover and a passionate pet parent myself. Very honored to be introduced to the family, and with some financial backing of a family office, acquired the business, and really through the last 6 years have just been focused on improving the product, really investing in technology, and then trying to expand the vet network to impact as many markets as we possibly can.
We have certainly watched the changes that have taken place over the past, I'd say really the past decade or so, in the way that people are caring for their pets. And so I'm curious, Erin, have you seen any changes in pet ownership that have also changed this demand for this pet benefit in the workplace?
Absolutely. And, there have been some generational changes that really COVID put a massive accelerator on. The path that I like to articulate is the dog or the pet really went from the backyard to the bedroom, and now honestly to the bassinet for a lot of families. So a lot of families, either they are the starter children, or in some cases, a lot of younger families are just foregoing having children altogether. So a joke that I can't claim credit for, but I've heard is that plants are the new pets, pets are the new kids, and kids are the new exotic animals. You have to be rich and a little crazy to think about having kids these days. We have both now, but we had two dogs, and, we had two dogs for a couple of years and could just kind of figure out each other and, how we were as pet parents before we had our human babies. And, really the lexicon has followed, right? So we're not dog owners anymore. We're pet parents. And I think the way that people think about their pets certainly has followed. And I think with that, the demand for pet-related benefits certainly has trailed that. And so a category really that I'll say when I started with United Pet Care, I'd say was regarded by a lot of brokers with increasing interest, was maybe met with I wouldn't say quite derision, but maybe curiosity, is now I think largely regarded as something that they at least need to understand and pay some attention to. Certainly it is still firmly in the nice to have benefit category, but it is something that a lot of benefit forward employers are saying, hey, this is something that is a meaningful component of particularly our younger employees' lives. And so it's something that we need to be contemplating offering if we're not already today.
Well, I think you're right. First of all, I love the joke. We own all three: plants, pets, and people. We have a child, but our first dog was named Grayson. He was gray and he was our son. And so I'm tracking with you very much. And I also love how you compare it to DPC, direct primary care, which is also really getting a lot of notoriety in its heyday. So I'm curious, much like employers are faced with all these options and making choices, how would an employer decide what type of pet-friendly policy or benefit would be right for them?
Yeah, I think another trend that maybe helps inform that, which is one that I think all employers are all too familiar with, is just the increasing cost pressure on employers and just quite frankly on the employee base. Obviously, medical renewals and that year over year cost increase takes a lot of the oxygen out of the room. But the reality is that just puts pressure on employees' wallets. And so figuring out the best way to impact the broadest percentage of the employee base while also understanding, and I'm sure there's probably a very empathetic audience within your listener base, the pressures that are put on the broker and really the HR teams, by extension, to administer a comprehensive benefits package with limited resources. So being asked to do more than ever before with probably a smaller team, if not the same size team than they've always had. So it really is a balancing act between things that are not going to be operationally onerous, but that are also going to be accessible to as broad a percentage of the employee base as possible. So, there's no perfect answer. Our view, of course, is maybe similar to a dental or a vision plan, particularly if you're a larger organization, because 70% of employees are pet parents today, and about 85% of millennial and Gen Z are pet parents, that it probably makes sense to have a high and a low option, which we would kind of view our plan from a price point perspective as a low, more accessible price point option, and then pet insurance being a more costly option, as long as that's going to be something that's not operationally difficult to administer. So one option could be there, our benefit is typically payroll deduction. The way that we make that operationally easy to administer is we have flat rate guaranteed pricing. So there's not individual payroll deductions to manage. And then there are a lot of individual pet insurance products that can be administered via direct bill, which takes all operational burden away from the human resources team.
Yeah. And this is a wonderful thing because it allows for customization, but there is this sea of benefits, especially as employers are using benefits very wisely to recruit and retain talent. And we've seen, at least on the Granite.List site, this explosion of voluntary benefits over the past couple of years. But what we also know, frankly, is that employee participation hasn't necessarily followed that trend. So if I'm an employer, HR leader, broker putting the plan together, why do I need to prioritize this over some of the other benefits that are out there?
It's a great question. And this is what I always tell our broker partners. We benefit from a category, and I say this as obviously somebody who is a deep believer in the value that our product category delivers. We're a category that benefits from being maybe more interesting than it is important. And again, I say that it is a very important category. It is really hard to get employees fired up about accidental death and dismemberment insurance, but that's probably a really important category, for people to have. Things like long-term planning, the retirement, these are incredibly important categories, but they may be difficult to engage employees on, particularly if it's a category that you've offered year after year after year. One of the things, and I know he's a friend of the Granite.List, that I love that Eric Silverman always says is, once you get employees engaged and in that buying motion, they're much more likely to engage and purchase other voluntary benefits because you've got them kind of hooked back in. And I think that is a place where our category, but our benefit specifically, really punches above its weight. Because again, if you're a pet parent, probably 8 of the first 10 pictures on your phone, unless you have kids, maybe, are of that pet. And so it is a reason to put butts in seats at open enrollment. If you haven't introduced a new benefit and time to kind of get people to look at their overall benefits package with fresh eyes. And so maybe even if they're not enrolling directly in our benefit, it gives a feeling of, hey, we are doing something that again is applicable to the vast majority of the workforce, and it's going to get somebody that maybe is not thinking about their benefits as broadly applicable to them. I'm still on my parents' health insurance plan. I'm not thinking about retirement because, quite frankly, I'm living paycheck to paycheck. And so I'm thinking about the cost pressures that are much more real to me today. But I've got these pets and they're the most important creatures in my life. I really feel like that's a place where employers can meet a big chunk of their workforce where they are today and maybe not miss them with the message that these are really important benefits, but maybe that's not landing. And that's where engagement is lacking with a more traditional benefits package.
Yeah, I mentioned that our first dog was named Grayson. Our second child that has 4 legs is named Jane after my mother. And so what you're describing is very real, that we do classify ourselves as pet parents. You've done a great job of articulating what the value is for employers. But I'm curious, for the group that is putting the plans together, the broker community, why should they be just as concerned?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because, again, brokers are expected to do more than ever before. And of course, especially on the voluntary side, nobody is doing this, making their year from a commission perspective. And obviously the overarching goal is to deliver value to their clients. I think you raised a really excellent point around the proliferation of voluntary benefit options. I think the role of the broker has really evolved over the course of the last, several years or so, where now from a rate negotiation perspective, a lot of people are going to have access to the same rates across the same carriers. And so the broker becomes a broker of information. And so, an interesting parallel that I always like to use is when Expedia and all these travel booking sites kind of came on the scene, there was the prediction that the death of the travel agent was kind of nigh upon us. And actually the opposite became true, that there were more travel agents than ever before because there was just so much information out there that you needed somebody to basically filter all of that down and, quite frankly, keep you from getting ripped off because there's a lot of bad stuff out there as well. And that's really where, I see brokers, good brokers, being able to add a lot of disproportionate value. Because employers are just getting bombarded, I'm sure, all the time. And a lot of these options out there are probably not going to be great fits, but they've all got day jobs. And so it's really hard to understand, what's going to be a good fit. So, my view on that is the brokers can be a really good partner and can really entrench themselves for the long haul and, quite frankly, put up a wall or a moat around their employer that's not going to be knocked down by a competing, entity that's going to save a percent or two or pitch something. They're not going to be dislodged if they are really viewed as a true partner and not somebody that's just turning over spreadsheets and turning over year cost. I think that's a place where you're always going to have difficult conversations. Medical renewals are going to continue to be a challenge. How do you create that trust-based relationship with your client? And I do think that really is in demonstrating an understanding of them, their employee base, their business, their needs. A lot of that is going to be around medical plan design and some of these big, rocks, of course. But I also think that a big part of that is understanding the holistic needs, their recruiting strategy, their strategy as an organization, the values that organization reflects. And to me, a benefits offering is an expression of company values as much as it is anything else. And I think the more that the broker understands that, the better that they can serve their client. And obviously, the better often position that they'll be long term.
So speaking of understanding, you mentioned this a little while ago, and I'd love for you to educate the audience a little bit more on what makes United Pet Care's product offering slightly different than traditional pet insurance.
Great question. So actually, we view our product to be extremely complementary to traditional pet insurance, certainly at an organizational level, but actually also at an individual level. So the way that our product operates is that we actually reduce the veterinary bill at the time of service. So basically, our service, we negotiate a discount off of a veterinarian's usual and customary fees on all in-house services. The way that pet insurance works, which a lot of people don't know, is that they actually reimburse you. You pay the veterinarian for services rendered, and then they reimburse you post facto based on the specifics of your policy. And so it operates a little bit differently than human health insurance, where there are actually negotiated rates and then they reimburse providers. And so in that way, we are very complementary products. And so effectively, you go to an in-network provider for UPC. That's kind of the limitation of our plan. With a pet insurance product, you can go anywhere. The advantage of our plan, or the restriction of traditional pet insurance, is that every pet qualifies for our plan and every pet pays the exact same rate. Brand new puppy. We have a 21-year-old cat actually on the plan. They pay the exact same rate, agnostic of pre-existing conditions, breed-specific conditions, anything like that. Obviously with pet insurance, because they bear risk and there's underwriting, the older the pet, the more expensive the policy. And then there are exclusions, understandably, for pre-existing and breed-specific conditions. And so kind of in a nutshell, that's how the two products work differently. Our product, there are no deductibles, there are no claim forms. It's a pretty straightforward experience. You go to an in-network vet, you present your card, and then when you get your invoice, it says, hey, you would have spent $1,000 on service A, B, C, and D. And because you're a United Pet Care member, you got $250 off of this service. You got $100 off of this service. And so your total bill was $600. And then the way pet insurance would work is you would pay that full bill. You would submit that claim to your pet insurance carrier. You would pay your deductible. They would take that out of your reimbursement. And then depending on your plan, you would have probably a 70, 80, or 90% copay. And then they would send that amount back to you for reimbursement.
So, we joked at the beginning about pandemic puppies. And I'm just curious, as we kind of close out today's show, where do you see this all headed? I mean, what trends are you all noticing?
So there's some very encouraging trends that are here to stay. And quite frankly, there are kind of some sad trends that I hope that we're able to reverse. The encouraging trend, I think, is the humanization of pets. And I think there is a real recognition of the positive impact that pets have on employee physical and really just human being physical and mental health. There's an amazing nonprofit organization called HABRI, Human Animal Bond Research Institute. And so it basically looks at, as the name would suggest, the bond between humans and animals and all of the really positive things that come from that. There are some pieces of legislation in different states and then also nationally that could, if passed, make pet insurance and related products actually eligible for HSA, FSA funds. That would open up a much wider pool of funds for things like pet insurance in our program, I think, which could be a really great breakthrough. So I think in general, we as a society are starting to evolve our view of, the pet not as property anymore, but as a member of the household. And I think that is really cool. And I think that is probably a trend that will continue. The worrying trend, which is related to the economic conditions of today, is we're seeing declining visits. Pet is generally regarded as a very resistant category. The elasticity of demand is high, but the limits of that are being tested. Fortunately, there's been a very high number of pets that have been returned to shelters over the course of the last couple of years. Vet visits are down year over year, even though revenue continues to increase, which means it's just a function of price. From a pet insurance perspective, also, there's a gap between premium growth and policy growth, and that gap continues to widen, again, which suggests that most of that growth is driven by price increases. And again, those price increases are largely driven by pass-through cost increases. They're not taking profits or anything like that. And so that consumer willingness and, quite frankly, ability to pay, because we know the willingness to pay is very high, is being tested as folks are just kind of feeling the pain everywhere economically. And so we believe that really a solution that is going to spread costs out, get people into the vet more early and often, and most importantly, reduce that financial anxiety around a trip to the vet is going to become incredibly important, because we are at an inflection point where there are a lot of folks who are first-time pet parents, and they can, really be soiled on that pet ownership experience if it becomes something that puts a tremendous amount of financial strain on them. And that's really something that it's the reason that we exist, that we hope to avoid that. Because as you know, Sally, as I know, and as we want as many people to experience as possible, these pets can just be an incredible exponent on joy and happiness in our lives. But it can be a terrible choice between your own financial well-being and the health of your pet when that huge vet bill comes up. And of course, through the lens of an employer, that becomes stress on the employee, that becomes a productivity drag, that becomes your problem by extension as well. So these are just things that are going to be in the consideration set for employees and their employers in the years to come.
Well, Aaron, that just goes to show that the work that you and your team do is so valuable to those of us who are pet parents and who want to give the best care and best quality of care to our fur babies. So I want to thank you and your group for being such wonderful partners and for being part of our community at the Granite.List. And I'd like to thank our audience for tuning into another episode of the Granite.List Live.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Granite.List Live. Access our entire library by visiting your favorite podcast venue. or subscribe on our site, thegranitelist.live.